Sometimes you hear the term death by a thousand cuts, like tiny little things that add up. And that's sort of the general case with aging too, right? In typical aging, in the absence of disease, slowly but surely you start to notice differences, right? Your memory might not be as good as it once was. Oh, you're forgetting where you left your keys or your wallet, whatever the case may be. And in pathological cases, obviously this is more extreme. I would argue it's similar with the cerebellum.
Hi, welcome back to Neurologic, the podcast brought to you by the Center for Vital Longevity at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm your host, Amber Kidwai, and my co-host today is somebody who's normally behind the camera.
Hi, I'm Hangu. I'm so excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Jessica Bernard, an endowed professor at Texas A&M University. Her research focuses on understanding how cognitive and motor behavior changes with age.
In this episode, we take a deep dive into the cerebellum. That's an often overlooked part of the brain. Case in point, this model doesn't have a cerebellum on it. The cerebellum is found at the bottom and at the back of the brain, and it's an area which is increasingly recognized as being essential for how we think, how we move, and how we age.
Well, most of our conversation about the brain focus on the cerebral cortex, the main part of the brain. The cerebellum has found to be having a much broader role than we once imagined, from fine-tuning movements to shaping cognition, memory, and even resilience in aging and disease.
To help us unpack this fascinating science, Dr. Bernard shares her research, which has been instrumental in redefining how we think about the cerebellum across the lifespan.
We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Dr. Bernard, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to talk to you about your work on the cerebellum, which is sadly an often ignored part of the brain. But before we get into your research, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what first got you interested in this kind of research?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So I am trained as a cognitive neuroscientist. In my background, I actually have an undergraduate degree in biological psychology, which essentially means half my coursework was in biology, half was in psychology. And this was before they had a formal neuroscience degree at my undergraduate institution. And it was neuroscience. And I knew going into graduate school, I was interested in understanding sort of the intersection of motor function, but also age-related neurodegenerative disease, be it Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, and how these things are linked. So when I was a grad student, it was the early to mid 2000s. I started in 2007, and people were thinking more and more about the cerebellum outside of the motor domain and in cognition as well. And it was something, in talking to my graduate mentor, Dr. Rachel Seidler, we were interested in looking at, first using resting state connectivity and then looking at structure and so on. And it's one of those, like, I started and the rest is history kind of moments. But that's exactly what happened. Started looking, couldn't stop.
Yeah.
In part because I think there are still so many exciting and interesting questions to answer.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when we talk about the brain, people usually think of the cerebral cortex, which you can see on this model on the table. It's the typical kind of two big hemispheres that we see, but just to prove your point, there's no cerebellum on the bottom of this model.
Nope.
So, but that is sadly an ignored part of the brain, even in neuroimaging. When we look at whatever types of studies we do, whether we're looking at connectivity or function, we see activity there and we just kind of ignore it. So there's obviously something important going on there. And it's recently gained more recognition as also being important and implicated in aging. So what is the cerebellum's function? What does it do?
This is a great question. And I think the best and easiest way to think about this is it helps us have smooth movement and smooth thought. And I know smooth thought is one of those vague, what does that even mean? But when we think about how the cerebellum works, I'll use motor as an example. You are sending out a motor command from the motor cortex down the spinal cord out to your muscles to move. And then there's feedback happening. You send out that motor command, and you also send what's called an efference copy, basically like a copy and paste of what you were trying to do, and that goes to the cerebellum. Your cerebellum is getting feedback from your body in the periphery, and essentially matching up with what it was told you were trying to do in that efferents copy and allowing you to correct online. So if you realize you're reaching for this mug of water, you can adjust a little. If you veer off course, am I in the right place? Is my arm and hand in this case doing what I said it was going to do from that motor command? With thought, we think it's sort of the same thing. I know this is a little bit weird, right? It's like, what is a thought? Philosophers, I'm sure, would love to answer that question also, right? As would cognitive scientists. But we have our thoughts, and those are also neural computations and commands. They're just happening in the prefrontal cortex. And the way this has been framed is that a similar type of computation is happening for our thoughts, just on different information. The feedback's not coming from your peripheral muscles. Instead, it's coming from the brain itself, right? As you're thinking through things, is this how I wanted to rehearse the sequence of numbers that makes up the new phone number I'm entering in my phone, or whatever the case may be? And when your cerebellum is intact, it allows you to do these things pretty automatically. You don't think about it. You probably reach for a cup of coffee or water all the time, and it just happens. Just like someone gives you their number or a couple of things to get at the grocery store, you're able to hold that in your working memory and remember that really easily without thinking too hard about it.
Yeah. So it's also involved in like automated processes as well, or things that we do automatically, basically, right?
Yes.
So how does that relate to kind of this online processing?
Yeah, so the idea is that we develop and form what would be called an internal model for these behaviors. And when you have an internal model, when you go to do something that you've already done, you're able to rely on that rather than having to think about it. So when we think about procedural learning, so things like riding a bike, for example, you just do it, right? And this is one of these examples. Sort of salient example, my son, he's almost 9. He's starting to play hockey, which is wild in Texas, but he's learning to ice skate. And we took him skating a week or so ago, and I haven't gone skating since it's been a while. We'll just say like a decade and a half. I know I did it once in grad school. But I grew up north, and we would skate outside on ponds, and we'd go to the skating rink, and something I knew how to do. He's like, Mom, you're not so bad at this. How can you still do this? Even though I haven't used those internal models for a while, there is still sort of some residual procedural knowledge there. And by no means was I any good, right? But I didn't fall. And after a few minutes of being on skates on the ice, I was able to pick it back up again pretty reasonably. And it's that sort of model and internal processing that happens. I couldn't tell you what I was thinking. I mostly was thinking, don't fall. But in terms of the motor commands, it just happened.
That makes sense. It's kind of that autopilot type of thing you have, where you're not really engaged, like they say, riding a bike, you're not really engaged in it, but somehow your body knows what to do. So that's all the cerebellum, basically.
In part, yes, we think so.
Okay, that's really interesting. So another really striking fact about the cerebellum is that it's quite small. It only makes up about 10% of the brain's volume, but it actually contains around 80% of its neurons, which is really
80% of surface area.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's more neurons in the cerebellum than the rest of the brain.
Wow. So why does it need so much processing power, and how is it packed into such a tiny space?
It's packed into such a tiny space with this intense folding. So like on your brain model here, you have those ridges and whatnot, your gyri and sulci. There's folding because it makes more space, essentially, to fit all of those neurons inside your skull. The cerebellum is even smaller with more neurons. So it's really dense. It's intensely folded. And which is why when you flatten it out, it's just about 80% of the size of the cortex. But these are computationally intense processes, right? And multiple things can be happening at once. You might be walking, you might be reaching, I'm reaching and talking and thinking about what I want to say next. So there's presumably some parallel processing going on. And again, I'm going to use a motor behavior as an example just because it's easier. We have a motor command, and the motor command is like, hey, reach the coffee mug. There are so many muscles involved in that, though, right? There's a lot of fine motor when you think about picking up. How are we doing this? So we might think of it as one movement, but it's actually very complicated. And you can imagine there's feedback for all of those different components that your cerebellum is processing. And thought is similarly complex as well. So it's not just working memory, it's what are the pieces, what are the elements, how do you hold things together and sequence them. So while they might seem, at least at the surface level, like a pretty simple computation, there's a lot of subcomponents that come into play.
That's true. That's a really good analogy. I mean, like with a mug, you're thinking about I need to reach for it and aim for it, but also hold it tight enough, but not too tight, and all those other things. There's a lot of feedback going on there. So studies have shown that different parts of the cerebellum communicate with different parts of the brain. So which brain regions does the cerebellum primarily talk to?
This is a good question. What I can say is we know based on structural analysis, so looking at the actual physical links, the axonal connections mapped with white matter, there are connections between the cerebellum and the primary motor cortex, which is where we get those, again, primary motor commands, premotor cortex, which is important for motor planning and motor initiation. We know there are connections with the parietal lobe. And we also know there are connections with the lateral prefrontal cortex. With that said, the assumption is that there are probably connections to other regions as well. But mapping white matter in the human brain can be really, really challenging because there's so much of it and it's so dense. So when we look at resting state functional connectivity, which is a way of looking at how brain areas are communicating with one another functionally when you're not doing
networks.
anything. Exactly. You can get a mapping of all of the cortical networks onto the cerebellum, which to me indicates that there's actually probably inputs via white matter from a lot of other regions. We just haven't figured out technologically with the methods we have now how we can map those carefully.
So given how connected it is to different brain areas, could we think of the cerebellum as being like the control center that kind of helps to regulate or fine-tune the brain activity?
I think that's fair. I don't know how much I would say it's regulating brain activity. I think of it more at fine-tuning, yes. Certainly updating, helping you update what you're doing so you can do it better. And I think that's a fair way of thinking about it. It's actually how I kind of like to think about it as well. When your cerebellum is doing what it's supposed to, it takes some of the strain, if you will, off of your cerebral cortex and those other resources.
So you can kind of offload a little bit onto the cerebellum, and then free up resources for other things. Okay. So what would happen if we were not able to do that kind of offloading?
You would start to see deficits in your behavior easily. And a lot of this comes, we have good data to support this from individuals that have had a cerebellar stroke, for example. We can look, and this was some really great work. Jeremy Schmalman did some of this early on, and others have since replicated these types of results when you have stroke in certain subregions of the cerebellum. So areas that we call Crus 1, Crus 2, these parts at the sides and at the back of the structure that are connected with the frontal cortex and are thought to be involved in cognitive function, you see deficits that are pretty specific to cognitive domains. People show problems with executive function, so organizing tasks and so on. They show some problems and challenges or deficits in emotional processing as well. So you start to see dysfunction ultimately, especially when you think about it in comparison to healthy, intact controls.
So a lot of research has focused, or most research actually, when we're looking at aging, has focused on the cerebral cortex, the main part of the brain. But based on your work, what are some of the changes that we see in the cerebellum in aging?
So there are a few things that we've shown happen. Number one, it gets smaller as we get older. And this is not unlike the cerebral cortex, where we see differences in volume. It doesn't, at least data from my own lab and from other individuals. Han and colleagues had a paper come out in, I believe it was 2020. Sometimes I get my years wrong. But they showed something similar. It's not necessarily uniform across the entire structure, but we see differences in structure for sure. There was also a really cool paper that came out, it would have been late 2025, in eLife from Roy Silito's group. I believe D'Onofrio is the first author on that. And what they found in rodents, but then also in postmortem human tissue, was evidence of a loss of cells, a particular type of cell, the Purkinje cell, which is a type of cell in the cerebellum. They're these beautiful cells that look kind of like trees and with really lovely branching. And they showed this in rodents, but then, like I said, they had some access to several histological samples from postmortem human tissue and found that as well. So it seems like there's some tissue loss, literal loss of neurons.
Yeah, yeah.
We also know that when we look at these resting state networks, and again, the functional interactions between regions, those on average are lower between the cerebellum and cortex as we get older, but not always.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see areas where connectivity is higher, and we've
As you age, it's higher.
yes,
Yeah.
it's usually lower, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's higher. And we've suggested this could be a couple things. One, it could be an attempt at compensating for changes in structure and other components of the network, or it could be a loss of specificity in those networks as well.
Yeah.
Right. The
And loss
network.
of specificity is something that is known to happen with age in
Exactly.
general with networks. Yeah.
Yes,
That would make sense.
exactly. And then finally, we've shown in one study, but also using neuroimaging meta-analysis, where you combine across a bunch of different studies, that the way the cerebellum is active during task performance is different as we get older. So it seems to be activated differently in cognitive tasks, so things like working memory, memory more generally, attention. Again, it seems across multiple studies like it's underactivated relative to younger adults, suggesting that older adults maybe aren't bringing this resource on quite as much or quite as effectively.
So then they would not be able to offload as much then. We should
Exactly.
make things harder for them to
Yeah,
do, right?
that's what we
So-
think is happening.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's
yes.
interesting. Okay. So speaking of memory, I mean, when we think of memory, we usually talk about the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain kind of deep in the
Yeah.
main cortex, which is known to be associated with memory, and especially in aging, it's one of the primary areas that kind of shrinks a lot, and therefore also has an impact on memory performance. But you've suggested that the cerebellum and the hippocampus are actually quite closely linked. So what does that mean for memory and aging?
I think this is a really great question. And it's an open question in a lot of ways. So we have been thinking about this a lot lately.
Yeah.
In fact, how is the cerebellum working with the hippocampus as part of a system for learning and memory that as we get older may be negatively impacted? Data from animal models suggests that there is unquestionably impact from cerebellar firing, cerebellar activation, that's probably in some way, don't know exactly how, modulating hippocampal activity and things like learning and memory. What is happening in the human brain? I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Can't wait to try to find out,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So do we think it's some kind of connectivity?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we have shown in the resting state again that these networks between the cerebellum and hippocampus are present, and those networks pretty robustly are lower as we get older.
Okay.
So we think, again, this is all in the hypothesis stage. We haven't gone in and done the empirical testing, but we think that they're not communicating as well. And as a result, this may impact, to some extent, our broader systems for memory. And it might be especially important when we start thinking about things like Alzheimer's disease, where, again, we know there's a lot of impact on the hippocampus. So what happens when one end of the system especially is lost,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
that's
to
what I was just thinking when
neurodegeneration.
you said that there is less connectivity. I wonder if it's because of the hippocampus shrinking,
Yeah.
or is it that on both ends there's some issues? That's
Yeah,
kind of-
so we know they're shrinking in the cerebellum. That's actually a great point. We have the data to look at this. Now I'm curious. Oh, my students are going to hate me. They're like, let's go look at some more stuff.
No, but I'm just I'm very fascinated by memory, so I'm just
Yeah.
wondering which way that relationship goes, and
It's tough. So in human studies, we don't have the same power to literally manipulate like one could in an animal model. And even there's of course limitations, right? I
But I'm
think.
thinking about like when you get humans who have hippocampal damage,
Oh yeah.
and how does that affect the cerebellum? The connectivity with the cerebellum,
Mm-hmm.
that could be.
I think people haven't looked at it to
yeah,
know.
yeah,
But I wonder what archival data there might be out
Yeah.
there to sort of get at some of these,
yeah.
right?
Get some of those images,
Or even
and
like
see.
I'm thinking about images from like patient HM,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah, yeah,
What sort of MR might be available to look at this, classic famous memory patient and see the degree to which those connections
yeah,
may differ
yeah,
relative to sort of age matched
yeah.
individuals.
That's really interesting. So how does the cerebellum become, or if it does become less efficient with aging, how would that show up in somebody's everyday behavior?
On the general day-to-day, I don't think it's going to be a stark difference, right? Sometimes you hear the term death by a thousand cuts, like tiny little things that add up. And that's sort of the general case with aging too, right? In typical aging, in the absence of disease, slowly but surely you start to notice differences, right? Your memory might not be as good as it once was. Oh, you're forgetting where you left your keys or your wallet, whatever the case may be. And in pathological cases, obviously this is more extreme. I would argue it's similar with the cerebellum.
Yeah.
It's also likely
Also, I'm thinking about like when you talk about the motor impact of the cerebellum, how people, the way they walk and carry themselves changes as they age.
Yes.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the cerebellum.
I bet it does. So we know it's impacted in balance.
Yeah.
And for sure. I am not a biomechanist. I tell my graduate students I'm teaching a cognitive neuroscience of aging class, and we have a couple biomechanists in there. Whenever stuff about walking comes up, I'm like, okay, I'm saying this as a neuroscientist. Yeah. But I think the answer is likely yes, there are dynamic balance measures, right? That whenever you're walking, you're balancing to an extent.
Yeah.
And gait most certainly has some relationships with the cerebellum there. And even when you think about it, I am in my 40s. My balance is still pretty decent.
Yeah.
But it's not what it was when I was 20.
Yeah.
Right? But one of the challenges we have when we're thinking about things like gait and balance, we know there are central differences and changes, right, in terms of the brain, the cerebellum. There are also peripheral changes in things like muscle mass and so on and so forth, core stability. So I think we have to be careful about parsing those out to try to understand how much of this is because there's a change to the central nervous system, in this case to the cerebellum.
Yeah.
And how much of this is a function of loss of muscle mass and so on.
Yeah.
So there's other considerations to bring in there.
Yeah, that's interesting because you do kind of, see this classic change in people's gait as they get older, right? And so, it would be interesting to know how much of that. So I wonder if then people who stay physically fit, if their gait doesn't change as much maybe as they age because, they have better muscle mass.
Yeah, I would assume the answer is yes.
Yeah.
We'd have to dig in the literature to see for sure.
Yeah.
But I would be shocked if the answer wasn't yes.
Yeah. So from what you're saying, your research suggests that the cerebellum works as a reserve or backup system, which can help to compensate for other kind of age-related brain changes. So does that mean that older adults rely on it more when they're doing tasks than, say, younger people?
Not necessarily. I think what's happening is that some older adults aren't using it as well as younger adults. And that's when we start to see some of that variability in behavior. And I think heterogeneity and individual differences are huge here.
Yeah.
When we look at our data, even when we'll plot people based on behavior and cerebellum, but we'll also put their age, different colors. And it seems to be that the cerebellum matters a lot. It's not always in our oldest old, right? So if you're using those resources and maintaining them, you're going to be okay. I shouldn't say you're going to be okay. You're going to be doing better than someone that's not.
Yeah.
So I think it's not that they're using them more. I think that they're being used differently and perhaps less. And because people can't rely on them, because there's breakdown in some of these networks and so on, your behavior becomes a little bit less precise.
So the cerebellum is kind of providing a type of resilience, would you say?
I think so.
Aging?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We very much think about it as a potential source of resilience.
Okay. So it gives you that kind of scaffolding so you can
Yes.
offload, the burden of work, I guess, or the processing that you need to the cerebellum. And if you don't have that, then it's more of a burden on your cortex and then you don't perform as well.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Does this happen for everything the cerebellum does, or does it depend on whether we're talking about movement versus cognitive tasks? Is it kind of across the spectrum, or?
So far, our data suggests that we see it in both.
Okay.
We see relationships with volume and connectivity in both cognitive and motor domains.
Yeah.
So it seems to be across the board. What I think is interesting to consider, looking at additional cognitive functions, so we look at largely like working memory, a little bit in terms of executive function. There's been a lot of really interesting work looking at social cognition. I'm curious, very genuinely, if that is impacted in older adults as well, or is if that's something that actually is maintained relatively well.
Yeah.
It's an open question, but it's, again, at this point, it seems like both.
Oh, that's really fascinating. So your work has also examined the role of the cerebellum in Alzheimer's disease and people with mild cognitive impairment. So how does the cerebellum change in people with these issues compared to those who are aging in a healthy way?
This is a really early, nascent sort of field, and we've started looking at this. When we think about the pathology of Alzheimer's, the cerebellum is not typically core to that pathology. But I think our understanding is also changing in that we need to look at it more. So there is data that suggests that subregions of the cerebellum are smaller in individuals with Alzheimer's.
Wow.
Yeah. And we have demonstrated in some
I wonder
of
if those parts are connected to the hippocampus. Just because the hippocampus is smaller in people with Alzheimer's.
So probably. I'm thinking about it, actually. So we know the differences are in this area called CRUS1,
Yeah.
CRUS2. And we absolutely have CRUS1 hippocampal connectivity that we've shown is associated with memory performance
so
in
fascinating.
adults.
Yeah.
So the question is, what if we looked at a specific Alzheimer's sample? And again, my students are going to
And which one came first?
this. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, it's a great question.
Yeah.
What's driving the
Yeah.
directionality
Is the hippocampus
here?
shrinking first, or is it the cerebellum area that's shrinking?
And this is where longitudinal data, so looking at one person or cohorts of people over multiple time points, is so important.
Yeah.
So you can start to think about that. But we know the connectivity is different. And this seems to be the case across networks within the cerebellum. We've looked at a couple ourselves, but there's some other groups out there that have shown similar things. And we've done some meta-analysis, again, combining across studies that show the way it's functionally engaged during tasks also differs in Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. But there's still a lot to be done here.
So like you're saying, the atrophy or the shrinkage in the cerebellum is often kind of mirrors the atrophy that we see in the cortex, right? So
Yes.
It would be interesting to see if the disease is kind of spreading to the cerebellum or whether they're both affected at the same time. Do you think some of the changes that we see in the cerebellum drive the symptoms that we see present in Alzheimer's disease or in mild cognitive impairment? Or do you think it's just that the cerebellum is not providing the level of support as it did before?
I think it's the latter, that the
Okay.
cerebellum is not providing the same level of support.
Okay.
And the way I think about this is if you're an individual with Alzheimer's pathology, thinking about this in terms of amyloid beta or tau pathology, and your cerebellum is still in pretty good shape, The way I have been thinking about this is that this might be a mark of relative resilience. So you may not show symptoms that are associated with cortical atrophy, again, underlying pathology, as early. You may be able to better sort of rely on that cerebellar scaffolding to maintain function for a little longer. I don't, however, think, at least at this point, that this is a main driver of dysfunction.
Yeah.
Rather, again, I see it as a key support system
Yeah.
that helps people maintain function for longer. And that's also why I think targeting this from an intervention approach might be really useful and helpful.
Yeah. So in your research, you've also said that some people who have patients who have mild cognitive impairment, which is like the precursor to Alzheimer's disease, they sometimes show higher connectivity in certain cerebellar areas. So does that mean the cerebellum is kind of working overtime to compensate for the symptoms of the disease?
This is what we think. Yeah, that's how we've been interpreting the data, at
Okay.
least. We don't have any sort of causal manipulation to say for sure, but that's actually how we've interpreted it. There's some start of disease process, it seems like, potentially, right? And yes, this is an attempt to sort of make up for that, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think like some kind of cerebellar test, like a simple balance test, might be something we could use as an earlier predictor of cognitive decline?
I think there's room to think about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have a really amazing colleague in motor neuroscience, Dr. Jenny Yentes, who's been super interested in gait for these exact reasons. And gait and balance, again, are inextricably linked.
Yeah. I mean, for people who don't know, when you do, people who get pulled over for
yeah.
drink driving, when they make you do those tests to kind of touch your nose or walk on a straight line, they're actually testing your cerebellum, right? Because
pretty much,
the cerebellum is very severely affected by alcohol, and that's what makes you not be able to do those things. So I'm wondering if those same tests could be used for cognitive decline.
When we talk about aging a lot, we also talk about things like stereotype threat. So an older adult will come in, they're told, oh, we have to look at your memory.
Yeah.
Well, they might perform more poorly because they're nervous about having their memory tested. Hey, Mrs. Jones, could you please just walk down the hall for us on this mat? Or could you please just stand here for a couple of minutes on this platform on the floor? That doesn't have necessarily as much of that threat.
The performance stress.
Stress. You just do it.
Yeah.
And it could be a useful measure for sure. I think there's a lot of power in looking at some of these other outside the cognitive domain measures that might provide little clues and insights into how different brain systems are working.
Yeah, because it's not necessary that the first symptom is memory decline, right? And often that's a later symptom where you have other things come first. But memory is the one that people notice the most.
Yes.
And then by the time you're having those severe memory symptoms and you've gone to a neurologist, it's often you're so far down the road that there's not much you can do about it. So any of these earlier things that you could kind of use to predict cognitive decline earlier might be useful for you to then intervene to try and delay the rest, the kind of downward track that you're on. So what happens when the cerebellum can no longer compensate for cognitive decline? Do we see like a rapid transition to dementia? What happens at that point?
So we don't know necessarily that it's a rapid transition to dementia, but I would expect that, yes, you would see a worsening of symptoms. And again, this is where longitudinal data will be really, really important. Tracking individuals with an eye towards the cerebellum, or if we can go back retrospectively into existing longitudinal data sets to see what happens as we look at cerebellar decline and then subsequent cognitive measures at future dates, right, and future waves of data collection. That is really, really important. My prediction, though, is that when you start to see this more robust cerebellar decline, there may very well be sort of like an inflection point, if you will, in terms of cognitive function, where it wasn't great to begin with, and because we're talking about disease, but maybe gets a bit worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of switching it up now a bit, I wanted to talk about sex differences in the cerebellum. So does the cerebellum change differently with age in men versus women?
We think so. So we spent some time looking at sex differences, but also impacts of hormones. Yeah. And our data, we are writing this up right now. My postdoc, Tamira Magales, has been working on some of this, suggest that, yeah, there absolutely are differences in males and females. So Tamira's had a paper come out in Human Brain Mapping in 2025 that showed sex differences in structure, connectivity, and different associations between different parts of the cerebellum.
Is that just like throughout the lifespan or in aging?
This is in a sample of adults from 35 to 86.
Okay, so even
it's
the
adulthood.
younger. Okay, wow.
And now she's looking at the longitudinal follow-up data here. But a paper, Han and colleagues, I think I mentioned this paper earlier. In this same paper, they also looked at cerebellar changes and found that some regions seem to shrink more in females relative than males, and others shrink less in females relative to males.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the cerebellum has an abundance of estrogen and progesterone receptors. So that makes it very sensitive to hormonal fluctuations as well. So why does it have so many hormonal receptors?
This is a good question. I actually don't know the answer and couldn't find a good answer either as to why. They're unevenly distributed across the brain, or I should say differentially. So some areas seem to be packed with them, others aren't, which presumably makes those areas, again, like you alluded to, more susceptible to the influence of hormones. But why is likely a genetic encoding sort of developmental fluke, if you will, or just a bit of that genetic magic?
So since there's so many receptors for estrogen and progesterone, what then happens in menopause when those hormones change?
Great question. It seems as though, so let me back up a little.
Yeah.
When we initially, this was back when I was a postdoc, we looked at some cerebellar data from individuals aged 12 to 65. So kind of from young adolescence through late middle age. And we found differing relationships in males and females. So the way in which they were fit by our models was different. So in females, there was a sort of quadratic fit, and things were kind of going up and up and up, and then a more precipitous drop off. That happened in midlife. We see this sort of peaking at the late 30s, early 40s, and then this drop off in females.
The drop off was in what? In cognitive
volume.
function? Oh, volume, okay.
Although we do see similar things in cognitive function for what it's worth,
Yeah.
in volume.
Yeah.
And the average age of menopause is about 52. There are data now that suggest you start to see some of these changes up to 10 years beforehand. And we think this may be some of what's going on. So we've been looking at this in more detail. And it seems to be the case that when we look at the networks of reproductive stage females relative to early and late postmenopausal, and this is all done based on time of last menstrual period. So how many years since you've last had a menstrual cycle, we see differences in those patterns of connectivity. And what's really interesting is we looked at this with males that were matched based on age. So some postmenopausal females are much younger than others, right?
Yeah.
So we had males that were matched, and these effects seem to be not just an age effect, right? So we see differing effects when we look at females relative to males across these groups. So there seem to be differences. And one of the areas that pops up, cerebellum and temporal lobes and these sort of hippocampal adjacent areas seem to show a more robust difference than in age-matched males, suggesting this is a reproductive stage and perhaps hormonally driven difference.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're following people longitudinally, or we just finished collecting that data, and we're actively looking at how their hormone levels relate to this connectivity and so on.
That's really fascinating. And so which sex hormones appear to play the most important role in cerebellar function?
So we have, it sort of depends on what we're looking at.
Yeah.
We have some data that was just published showing differing relationships between levels of both 17 beta estradiol and progesterone and connectivity between the cerebellum and hippocampus. The other thing that I think is interesting is that testosterone pops up quite a lot for us.
Okay.
And I think what's happening is, especially in females,
Yeah.
when you are postmenopausal and you have, after your ovarian function has essentially ceased and you're no longer producing these robust levels of estradiol and progesterone, there's more room for testosterone to play a role, right? You've sort of gotten rid of these other factors, so it's eating up some of that variance. But we found it kind of interesting, the way in which that has been related to motor behaviors, cerebellar-mediated motor behaviors, and some of our cerebellar measures. But we're really interested in these cerebellar hippocampal interactions and how both 17-beta estradiol and progesterone seem to be involved.
So those declines you were talking about earlier in women with, the decline in estrogen and progesterone, you were talking about in the volume and in cognitive function. Did you see any declines in terms of motor function or connectivity?
Yep. Yeah, sorry, that's a terrible answer. Yep. But yes. So I have...
Because that's not something you think of as happening with menopause or ages. You think of cognitive change and...
So I have a really wonderful post-bac research coordinator, Geraldine James, who has been looking at exactly this. So she presented a little bit of this work at the Dallas Aging and Cognition Conference. It would have been in 2025.
Okay.
And she has found some really neat things with respect to menopausal stage and motor behaviors and the hormones.
Yeah.
So she's working on writing this up right now, actually, as one of her first publications. But it does seem to be the case that, motor behavior is definitely impacted. And when we look at the males, we see different patterns. So we think that this is something to do, at least in part, probably not entirely, but in part, due to some of these hormonal differences and changes.
Okay. That's really interesting. Yeah. So, that's really fascinating. I was also just thinking about, the hormonal changes and their impact on the cerebellum. What about when women are taking like hormone replacement therapy? Does that mean they don't get those declines, or does it, how does it impact?
We don't know yet. We don't know.
Yeah.
So in the work we've been doing currently, we have excluded individuals that are taking any sort of hormone therapy, or in our younger females, any sort of hormonal contraceptives.
Yeah, because we actually had one of our podcast episodes was looking at women, Alzheimer's disease in women specifically. We had the talk with Rachel Buckley, Dr. Buckley.
Her work is wonderful.
Yeah, and we were talking about how women who take HRT actually does help with cognitive function.
Yes.
So that makes me think about the impacts on the cerebellum, since we know how much that is involved in cognitive function. And then you're talking about how it has such a high amount of hormone receptors.
Yes. So in our sample currently, we don't have anyone on HRT.
Yeah.
I am in the midst of what we would call a dense sampling project. This is a project done in collaboration with Dr. Allison Weiss at Oregon Health Sciences University. We were generously funded by a group out there. They're supporting this work. And what we're doing is we are doing resting state connectivity every week for 6 months in perimenopausal females as well as postmenopausal females. And within those groups, we have 4 and 4. Half of them are on hormone therapy and half are not. So we're going to be able to start to look at this both from a whole brain dynamics approach, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't super excited to see what
So
was
basically,
happening.
you're going to put them in an MRI scanner and look at the connectivity in their brain while they're just kind of resting, basically, not doing any activity.
They're just hanging out, relaxing. And we're getting hormone samples every week before they go into the scanner. So we'll know what those hormone levels are like essentially at the time of the scan. And we can look at that with respect to the dynamics of brain connectivity with and without hormone therapy.
Yeah. And then you were talking about how testosterone is so important when it comes to the cerebellum, but I'm wondering, I mean, don't men also experience declines in hormone with age?
They
in their hormones?
do.
Yeah.
But it's not as dramatic.
Okay.
So it is absolutely the case
Yeah.
that there are decreases in androgens as we get older.
Mm-hmm.
But you think of it as more of a slow and steady, and certainly some men are more impacted by this than others. But it's pretty markedly different from females who effectively post-menopause, you lose reproductive capacity, right? It's not the same in males.
Yeah.
Males maintain,
Yeah.
to some extent, their reproductive function
Yeah.
up till death,
Yeah.
right? You'll
Yeah.
hear about males in their 80s and whatnot occasionally fathering children.
Yeah.
And that's because they maintain reproductive capacity while their androgens have decreased some. It's not like females
Yeah.
where
So the
it
impact on the
essentially drops.
cerebellum is probably not going to be as
Yes.
extreme as well.
Exactly. And we're trying to tease that apart because I think it's important to know. So when we think about things like precision medicine, so we can work and target things in males and females more effectively if we know how these dynamics are working.
Yeah. That's an interesting area of research I think
Yeah.
we need to look more into. So talking about, kind of teasing these things apart and looking at what we can do to intervene early before cognitive decline happens. A lot of your research has used neurostimulation techniques
Yes.
to intervene. So different techniques like transcranial direct current stimulation, which is where you have it's a non-invasive technique, right? Where you have electrodes that kind of are placed on the scalp and put a weak electrical current through the brain, or TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you kind of hold something over the scalp and it just kind of zaps a bit of a magnetic pulse, and it's also kind of non-invasive and not painful or anything like that. And so you've been kind of targeting the cerebellum, which is kind of probably hard to do because it's so kind of low at the bottom of the brain and the back of the brain. But what have you seen when you stimulate those areas, and what does it mean for intervening in terms of cognitive decline?
Yeah, so we had a recent piece come out. This was led by a postdoc of mine, Dr. Ashwini Sansare, and this was in collaboration. She's co-mentored by myself and Dr. Yuming Lei in motor neuroscience, where we use this stimulation, the theta burst, which is a type of TMS. It's just the pattern that the pulses get to the brain. She did this over the cerebellum, and she showed that in cognitively normal older adults, there is a really robust improvement in balance performance from pre-stimulation out to 30 minutes after. She also had a group that had a sham condition, so it was everything was essentially the same. Exactly, it's like a placebo, and they don't show this at all.
Okay.
So there's a difference between the sham condition and real.
So if you do a magnetic stimulation to the cerebellum from outside the scalp, you do actually see an effect on motor behavior and improvement.
Yes, an improvement in balance. And we're looking at this right now. We were generously funded by the Woodnex Foundation to do some work on this with cognitive function in aging and in individuals that are showing some degree of cognitive decline. And we're seeing some individuals are showing really positive, robust responses. There are some that aren't, but we're trying to tease apart why, right? So the question is, are there some underlying network differences? Is it the case? So we're just doing one stimulation session. Maybe some individuals need more, right? 2 or 3, and then they'll start to show the benefits.
So are there specific regions of the cerebellum or networks of the cerebellum that you're trying to target?
With respect to TMS, we can't get some of the more classic motor regions just because they're tucked up and underneath the bottom parts of the brain. We're getting what we call the lateral posterior, the part right at the back closest to the skull. That's an area that is associated with the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
So we're targeting there currently.
That's really fascinating because you're seeing the effects in motor behavior, even though you're not targeting the motor regions of the cerebellum, you're targeting more the control regions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we do see these motor effects. And this is in part because we don't think about things like balance being cognitive tasks, but those systems are involved to an extent, for sure.
Just we're not aware of them so much.
Exactly.
I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Versus when you're thinking about something, which is, a typical cognitive task is like memory or attention and that kind of thing. Yeah. So when we use TMS, this magnetic stimulation on the main part of the brain, on the cortex, usually it works by exciting neurons and making them fire. But in the cerebellum, it can actually have the reverse effect because the cerebellum is wired differently. So it's almost kind of like putting the brakes on the brain. So can you explain why stimulating the cerebellum might actually quiet the rest of the brain?
Okay, we're going to get into some intense physiology. I don't know, do we want to go there? I mean, we can go
at a
there.
high level.
Okay. Yeah, so it seems like the way the cerebellum works, essentially, we are, quieting down. You're inhibiting an inhibitor or exciting an inhibitor right? So there are
Okay.
different ways we can think about it. These are inhibitory circuits. If you are exciting an inhibitor, you're going to have more inhibition.
So you're like pressing the brakes,
Yes.
basically, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that can release inhibition on the cortex,
Yeah.
right? On the flip side, if you inhibit an inhibitor, you're then having more inhibition on the cortex. I know we're getting into
Wait,
this,
if
like,
you
I
inhibit
know.
an inhibitor, you're having
You're
more
more
inhibition. If you inhibit an inhibitor, you would not be inhibiting the cortex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you're releasing the inhibition.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
you're kind of taking your
Thank
foot
you.
off the
Yeah,
brake, and
it's
so
foot
the
off the
cortex
brake.
is going to
Yes.
do what it's doing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I said, we're into these into the weeds of physiology here. But it seems like, at least with transcranial direct current stimulation, we think that's what's happening, because in some polarities, which is some way of stimulating, either kind of like an ramp up versus ramp down, it works the opposite way in the cerebellum. And we think this has to do with the underlying physiology of the structure.
Okay. So that's really interesting to think that kind of putting the brakes on the brain would give you better balance than.
So here's where it gets confusing.
Yeah.
ITBS in the cortex is thought to be excitatory.
Yeah.
And we do seem to see some sort of excitatory effect. Or we see similar positive effects when we do it to the cerebellum as we do to the cortex, but not with TDCS. And I suspect this has to do with how the underlying physiology is impacted by the different types of stimulation. A lower
Because
level,
TDCS is direct current stimulation. That's
Yes.
actually using electrical currents
exactly,
going into the brain, whereas TMS is magnetic.
exactly.
So the magnetic is causing inhibition.
So it's a magnetic pulse that induces electrical activity in the brain.
Yeah.
And it may be doing so, in a different way.
In a way,
and these
yeah.
are like individual pulses, whereas when we do the TDCS, our protocols have been 20 minutes of low level stimulation.
Yeah.
So the mechanism of action may be different. And there's, again, some complex underlying physiology here that we really need to tease apart to better understand the hows and the whys.
So how promising do you think these neurostimulation techniques are as a potential treatment for something like Alzheimer's disease?
So it depends on how we want to frame treatment. I want to be pretty clear, and whenever I talk about this, we're not going to be reversing the pathology, unfortunately, right? There are various anti-amyloid therapies that are available now that do seem to clear amyloid from the brain. But I do think these are a really important potential adjunct for helping maintain function and maintain quality of life. Because if we can jumpstart this scaffolding, then it may be the case that individuals are better able to live independently or less care for longer. Their quality of life may be improved as a result. So we're not sort of stopping pathology in its tracks, but we think we might be able to use these approaches to boost the scaffolding, to help other things be maintained for longer, and at least, like I said, slow things down and then improve quality of life, which is important, obviously, for patients, but also for caregivers as well, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we talk about dementia, we know there's no cure for it. And it's just a case of if you can even prolong the onset of it, or when you have it, just slow down the rate of decline, you can make such a huge impact on people's quality of life. So anything that can do that is definitely going to be of interest. I mean, do you think this is something that people would have accessibility to one day?
I hope. One of the things that we've been thinking more about, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, is typically tied to lab-based settings or medical centers and requires coming in to see us. TDCS, direct current stimulation, can be administered in home-based settings. So I think...
Is that something that already people do for other issues, or... Like, do people administer that in a home setting?
There have been trials where people have started to do this at home. And Soterix, which is a company that makes them, has stimulators that you can send home, and they're designed, you enter your code, and it gives you the correct stimulation. So we're interested in starting to look at this and test this, because when we think about a state like Texas, it's huge. We're sitting here in Dallas. Obviously, it's a population center. There are parts of the state that are really remote. There are older adults there that may very well benefit from this. So I think there's a lot of need and power in looking at these alternative approaches. So yes, TMS may work really well. Maybe we can tweak TDCS approaches, because if that means someone can do it in the home, we can reach a lot more people that might be a bit more remote. And this, again, improving quality of life for the individual. But I also think about caregivers as well, as they're often the ones that have to help drive that loved one in. It takes time away from their day. If we can improve quality of life for both, I think that's potentially really huge.
Yeah, it's really huge. I mean, to give people access to some kind of intervention, which is also not pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
So, you're not thinking about all those side effects and the cost of that as well, I think is really kind of groundbreaking and really exciting. So thanks so much for talking to us today. What would you say is your take-home message to listeners who are looking to support their cerebellum health?
This is, I think, in general for for brain health broadly.
Yeah.
So whenever I teach psychology of aging, I always sort of joke with my students that the best thing all of us can do is go out for a nice walk, get some cardiovascular exercise, get a good night's sleep, and to the best of our abilities, eat a balanced diet.
Yeah.
I know that can be really challenging depending on dietary restrictions, food access, etc. But the more we can do to maintain our cardiovascular and metabolic health, we know this is great for brain health, and cerebellar health matters there as well.
Yeah.
I'd also recommend Tai Chi, in all seriousness, because it's something that can challenge your balance function a little bit. It's upright.
Yeah.
There's been some really cool data showing the benefits of that type of movement. Or if you like yoga, I am not good at yoga. Whenever I try it, though, I realize just how hard it is. But again, when you think about challenging balance, you're moving your body, you're challenging your muscles in new ways.
Yeah.
I don't have any hard and fast data that shows that this is going to improve cerebellar function. I'd be shocked if it doesn't when I think about the different poses that one works through and so on and so forth.
So it's general kind of good health.
Good
advice.
health.
Yeah. We always say what's good for the heart is good for the brain.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bernard, for taking the time to sit with us and share your research. And we had such an interesting conversation about the cerebellum. And I hope that more people will take notice of that little area of the brain, which we've all kind of ignored for so long. And so where can people learn more about your research?
You can look at my website, which can be found if you go to the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Texas A&M University. If you go to my faculty page there, website is linked, as is Google Scholar, where you could find papers if you feel so inclined to read those. But you'll find out more at that website.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to Neurologic, the CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others.
This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran, our marketing and operations producer, and Pan Gu, our audio-video producer and editor.
To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan.
Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.